Hi, and welcome back to Good Distinctions. I'm your host, Will Wright, and joining me today is Fran Maier, author of True Confessions, Voices of Faith from a Life in the Church by Ignatius Press, that just came out. Also happens to be a great gentleman who I've been on a panel with a few times for the Tepeyac Leadership Initiative. And so it's a real joy to have you on the program today, Fran.
Oh, it's a delight to be with you. Well, I mean, I'm happy to talk about just about anything you want to ask me.
Fantastic. Well, I'll start off real easy. Who are you?
It sounds like a fundamental philosophical question. Well, I'm a scholar with the Ethics and Public Policy Center. For 23 years, I was special assistant and basically chief of staff to Archbishop Charles Chaput in Denver and then in Philadelphia. Before that, I was an editor with the National Catholic Register. And before that, I was a screenwriter and a story analyst in LA. So my background is that. I have 4 kids, 11 grandkids, been married 54 years, haven't been kicked out of the house yet. So I guess I'm a keeper.
That's a good track record for sure. So this book was absolutely phenomenal to read. I know on the very front of the book it says a fascinating shot of the life of the Catholic Church in the 21st century, and that was from Cardinal Dolan in New York. And I think he's dead right on that. It's a very interesting sort of book because you spent about 17 months from December 2020 to May 2022 interviewing about 103 different people, bishops, clergy, religious, laymen and women. And then you sort of put all of these things together in this account, which has very minimal commentary on your part. It's mostly just the text of the interviews, which I thought was fascinating. I mean, so starting off pretty simply, how did this come about? What started this process?
Yeah, it's a good question because typically people want to tell you, I mean, when you worked in the church as long as I have, you become a talking head in a sense. And the temptation is to write like the book of the century on some subject that you happen to know about. Frankly, I bore myself, and I'm bored by a lot of the talking heads in the church because it becomes a profession where you are supposed to have an opinion about everything. And it kind of detaches you from the grassroots in the church. And so there was a risk in writing a book that is probably about 80% interviews. I do have a chapter at the beginning and at the end that's my commentary, and I have commentary in each of the chapters, but primarily it's an engagement of these 103 people. And there's a risk in that because some people don't like to read interviews. But the point is, they're all edited for readability. I wanted to hear what they had to say because they're the ones that are actually making the church work when she works. And they don't get an opportunity to talk very often and be listened to. And so that was my goal, was not so much to promote, certainly not to promote myself, but to promote the views of people that actually took the faith seriously and wanted to talk about it. And when they do talk about it, Will, as you know, having read the book, I mean, they're very frank. They don't hold back in some of their criticism, which is always motivated by love, but it's frankly very honest. And I was very accustomed to that because that's the way Archbishop Chaput ran his diocese. I mean, if you were respectful, you could tell him anything if it was truthful, and he would never blow back on you. He wanted the truth. You can't begin to fix a problem or heal a disease until you know what the problem actually consists of and what the disease is. And so part of the book is simply explaining what people have perceived about the strengths and the weaknesses of the church. And I think you come away from it, frankly, satisfied that it's truthful and also deeply hopeful about the future, because we've been through this 100 times in the past and always come through it because people of faith make it happen.
Oh, and that definitely came through. I mean, I definitely sensed not even just a note of optimism. I mean, there's a very real faith on the part of many of these people that you interviewed. And I found it interesting, just a few days before we were recording now, National Catholic Reporter ran a piece on it. I'm sure you saw that.
No, I deliberately didn't read it, but I've heard about it.
It's there's no reason to read it. It's Mr. Winter's just doing his thing, but it's interesting to me because they took a very different view away from the book. There was a few moments that they brought out as saying, like, here's something that we think is very true, which was nice to see. Normally, a lot of the times you don't get that sort of spin. One of the things was Christopher Pereira's comments from Archbishop Gomez. But they also seem to totally misunderstand the point, which
That's not a surprise, Will.
it's not a surprise at all. But it was like it was a total diametric shift where instead of finding hope, they said the church must be in an absolute mess if these people are correct. And I thought the only reason I bring it up is because obviously that's what they're going to say. I mean, everyone has a bias. Every publication has a particular bias. National Catholic Reporter as being more progressive or left leaning, and National Catholic Register as being more conservative. I'm not even sure how it's styled at times. I mean, it's certainly not traditionalist, but more conservative, right?
Yeah.
And so I guess that leads me to two questions. One is, how would you respond to someone who read this and said, the church isn't nearly as bad as the people are saying it is?
How would I respond to that?
Yeah.
I would say that that's true. It's not nearly as bad as people think. I mean, it's if you only read the media, and by the media I mean the National Catholic Reporter as well as all the secular media that pile on the church.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you would naturally get very depressed. But if you know the church's history, there's no way that you could be depressed. I mean, this stuff has happened again and again and again. And one of the problems with American culture is that, you know, we're a novus ordo seclorum. We're a new order of the ages. That's hardwired into our DNA. And we don't like the past. We don't want to remember because we want to be new. We want to be able to remake ourselves. But if you're Jewish or Christian, I mean, biblical faith is rooted in the past and is a source of enormous hope. You know, there's one of my favorite writers is, the great French Catholic writer of the last century, Georges Bernanos. He wrote a fantastic essay in the 1940s called Our Friends the Saints. And in that, his point is that the church, you know, craters and goes through a period of suffering, and then the revival comes from the emergence of the saints of the period. You know, this is again and again and again. But he has a great line that I've never forgotten. He said that the story of the church through history is the story of a constant train wreck, and we just make a mess of things. But the mess creates the environment where the saints that are necessary for revival emerge. And so for me, frankly, and I think the people that I interviewed in the book, you know, recognizing the problems can be very, very sobering, but they're not despairing because of the reasons that I outlined a moment ago. But I mean, it's a wonderful time to be a Christian if you take the faith seriously, because you have to ante up. You have to actually prove that you believe something. Right. And in this country for the last 60 years, it's been really pretty easy to be a Catholic. And that's not normal. It's not normal. So I feel exhilarated, actually, which I'm German Irish, and that's a rare it's a rare statement coming from me. But I mean, I came away from the whole experience just feeling really pretty good. You know, I was just browsing through the book again this morning, getting ready for this interview, and I thought, God, who wrote this stuff? Because I mean, it just made me feel good reading some of the people. I mean, if you read nothing else in the book, read the interview with Ursula and Matt Hennessy in the Special People chapter. It's extraordinary. It is absolutely. It's moving every time I read it, and tremendously uplifting. And there's that, you see that again and again in the people that the people I interviewed. And, you know, candidly, bishops don't speak frankly very often because they can't afford it. I mean, they get beat up on both sides. But the guys that I interviewed, and I insisted on anonymity. That came from me, not from them.
I was going to ask about that. So if you could expand on why.
I mean, I did that knowing that some people would say, well, gee, why are they anonymous? Well, they're anonymous because whatever they say, they get beat up. And so what does that do? It can make them excessively prudent in what their comments are. And I didn't want that. I wanted what they actually thought. Right. And when they felt comfortable that they could say what they actually thought without being, you know, dogpiled, we got some extraordinary interviews. I mean, guys that were that emerge as really very human, frank about the problems of their own life and the life of their priests and their people. And that's just I don't know where else I've ever seen that kind of candor from bishops. And again, you come away from it thinking, yeah, these guys are pretty good guys, and we should trust them because they're trustworthy.
Yeah, and that's certainly not a reputation that the bishops have had as of late. I think as a result, at least from my own perspective, as someone who's in their early 30s, bishops are not seen as overly trustworthy in the United States because of the cover-ups of the sex abuse scandal, or because of the imprudence in, or as you say, the overprudence, right? Not speaking truth when they're put up against the wall by, as you say, both sides. So it was really, really refreshing to see the candor of these bishops in the interviews.
Yeah, and one of the things that I want to highlight to people who hear this podcast is that, people should be angry for the history of sex abuse in the church. But they also need to understand that an enormous amount has been done to fix that, more than any other
Absolutely.
institution. And look, we have a son with Down syndrome, and we have 3 of our grandkids are special needs. And if anybody knows anything about the special needs community, it's that they're 10 times more likely to be sexually abused. So this for us is it's a real intimate issue. What gets me angry, not just at the church, at some of the leaders in the church who have and priests who've done these terrible things, is that we're just a drop in the bucket of the sex abuse problem in this country.
Yeah.
Public institutions in this country are terrible in their record, and they never get held accountable in the way that we are. And I'm upset about that. Why? Because my son went through public school, which is one of the major institutions where sex abuse happens. And you never see it covered in the same way that the Catholic Church is. So I think people need to they should be angry about some of the past sins. But they need to be angry about the problem in general and fix the problem in general, and not just concentrate on beating up the Catholic Church, because that's just stupid.
Well, and they're a fairly easy target, at least as far as the secular media is concerned, because they don't fight back, right?
Right. We don't fight
There's
back.
the idea. You got to turn the other cheek, so just take it.
Yeah.
There's a... What was... I'm going to edit this part out. I had another question and it just went away.
Get used to that, Will. It happens a lot more. Doesn't get better as you get older, Will.
Well, I'm ready, I guess. That's why I write everything down. And then I lost my question sheet. I had it up on the screen and it went away. Can't find it.
No problem.
Let's see. Right. So apart from the bishops, well, actually, including the bishops that you interviewed, how did you pick the 103 that you picked? Like, what was the litmus test, if you will?
Yeah. Well, the things that excluded people were any perception of extremism on either end of the ecclesial spectrum. And I mean, perception, whether it's real or not, is another matter. I mean, I didn't. And when I say this, I don't want it to appear to tar anybody. But for example, I didn't interview Bishop Strickland, and I didn't approach McElroy or Cardinal McElroy or Supich, because they're identified too strongly with a particular point that is controversial.
Right.
I just wanted to talk to normal people who are faithful, and that included the bishops. So once you say that about the bishops, then the next question becomes, well, how do we get a good spectrum? And I wanted to do that geographically. So the bishops are from 25 states, urban and rural dioceses, north, south, east, west. And I think there was one foreign bishop that knew the United States very well that I wanted to talk to. So that took care of the bishops. Then if you're familiar with the book at all, the structure that I had was people who had dedicated their life either as priest, deacon, religious. There was a chapter on them. There was a chapter on the financial problems in the church and fixing them. There was a chapter of very focused on lay people. There are a lot of the book is focused on lay people, but there was a chapter that was specifically focused on what I called formators. I mean, educators, parents, that were in charge of forming people at critical moments. And that was women and men. divided equally. Then a chapter on special needs, chapter on new Americans, people who had emigrated here from Latin America. So, I mean, I tried to get as many different perspectives as I could within that context of basic fidelity, and I hope I succeeded. I think I did.
No, I think you did for sure. What did strike me was just the broad net that you cast in this. So it was interesting to hear how you sort of walked through, okay, who exactly should I pick? Because the fidelity very much came through, which, I mean, if you're writing a book like this or presenting a snapshot of the church, you want someone with a lived affinity of the faith, someone who actually cares, who's actually giving their life to Christ and the church. And that did come through for sure.
Of course, I had an advantage having worked I was in diocesan service for 27 years, 23 of them with Archbishop Chaput. And then since then, 4 years, after we both retired. But so there was when you work that long in senior diocesan service without getting fired, you develop a reputation of discretion. And so it wasn't really very hard for me to get people to speak because they more or less knew I was going to treat them properly. So they relaxed and they said what they thought. So really the hard part was these interviews were in transcription anywhere from 7,000 to more than 10,000 words. Mm-hmm. And if you wrote, there's no way you can possibly publish all those words without having a 10,000 page book, which nobody will read. So I had to edit the material and adapt it and then get it approved by the people that were being quoted by name. So it was that was the laborious part. That's why it took 17 months to get the material. And then, of course, it was another year and a half to actually get it into shape to publish. Looking back on it, there were many times in the process I thought, what in the name of God have I gotten myself into? Because I can't imagine this A being done or B, anybody reading it. Looking back on it, I don't think anything, I honestly think that I haven't seen anything like this.
No.
In my career, and it holds up, I think, pretty well. And I think people who read it have been positively affected by it, and have said so. I hope so, anyway.
Well, it's definitely a different sort of book. I think what you were saying about the talking heads just sort of writing something on something that they know a lot about. There's a place for that. I enjoy those books. I read them all the time. But you can pretty much summarize a book in 1, 2, or 3 points. I mean, a book really could be an article. You're not going to get all the details and the nuances, but you can usually tell somebody, like if I hand my theology teacher friend a book and I say, here's the book, and he says, oh, what's it about? I'll give him a sentence. Mm-hmm. And he'll go, okay, great. And then he reads it and I'll go, how did you like it? And he repeats back the exact same sentence. Like, perfect. We got it then. But with this, you've got 103 sentences at least, right? Yeah. So it's interesting because if somebody tries to pick it apart, they can't pick it apart. They'd have to go through each statement and say, well, Fran Maier, he's saying this. And it's like, well, no, actually, this is what Tim Bush is saying this. So deal with what he's saying.
Tim's an interesting, all these people are interesting characters. Catholics are interesting. I mean, if they take it seriously, it kind of shapes their life in a way that simultaneously fits their personality, but also makes them grow and have interesting perspectives on the world. And of course, Tim is an example. Each of the investors, each of the wealthy people who have invested in the church, are really interesting people. I mean, they're Frank Hanna. I mean, the Siemens. They're just the Neils. For heaven's sakes, they're tremendously generous to the church. They're all interesting folks. And then there's a chapter immediately after that on what works in the church. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think people need to realize, since we were just talking about sentences that describe a book, if you were to describe the book True Confessions, I hope people would say, hey, we got a lot of problems, but and here's what they are. But hey, it's not so bad, and there's all these other great things happening to make them better. If you look at the lay apostolates in this country, mm-hmm. It's astounding. We at the beginning you mentioned the Tepeyac initiative. And Chris Pereira is a perfect example of guys doing really superb work, and nobody hears
Absolutely.
about them. That's one of the reasons he's in the book, because I wanted to profile. He's extremely candid, by the way, as I'm sure you
Yeah.
know. I mean,
Well, he is in personal life too.
yeah. I
He'll
mean, and
just
I
say
just
exactly
thought,
what's on his mind.
good Lord. I mean, that's just
Yeah.
perfect. That's exactly what I was looking for, because his candor is motivated by an absolutely profound love for the church.
Hmm.
And when you get those two things in sync, wow, I mean, you got really interesting stuff. Um, so I think you can't read the book and come away depressed,
No.
because you think, yeah, gee, we are in a jam, but yeah, it's also getting better and it's going to get better. I just have to live up to what I claim to believe. And I think, by the way, Will, that's the central issue of American Catholicism right now, is that it's been easy for us to say we were Catholic. Now we have to show it in a way
Hmm.
that we never did, because the culture supported us, and now it doesn't. We're the most material. I believe that we are the most materialist culture in human history, you know, and it's kind of a soft totalitarianism that goes with it. And a number of the bishops in the book actually talk about that it's not Soviet or Nazi type totalitarianism. It's much more delightful, but it shapes us with
Hmm.
appetites that are really unhealthy.
Well, and you've also done something sort of as a consequence of having these 103 people from all over the country, different regions, different apostolates, different states in life, is that someone can read this book who is attempting to be faithful and say, wow, there's people like me all over the country. So, I
Mhm.
mean, that should give us hope,
Yeah,
right? Is
so I
that,
hope so, because it's true. I mean, we're there's a lot wrong with this country. I mean, a lot wrong, and
Mhm.
it's not right now getting better. But we can never forget that there's also tens of millions of people who are active, committed Christians in this country. There's still a very strong biblical leaven. So it's not all going to hell in a handbasket. And the more that we think it is, the more that it will. And we just
Mhm.
have to own the missionary discipleship that's our vocation, which we've been doing a pretty poor job of over the last 60 years.
Well, and it seems like with the rise of social media, especially, I mean, the internet's a remarkable tool. Social media can be a remarkable tool, but what it's created is these silos where the extremism that you've avoided in the book has been able to flourish and draw more people in. I mean, I feel like this hit critical mass probably during the COVID pandemic because people were at home more,
Yeah.
they were, insular. But it seems that a lot of the people that I know, because I was working in a parish at the time, were either becoming extreme in their views, or they were finding some moderate ground, or they were extreme before COVID, and then everything happened, and they're looking at all these different voices on the internet. They're saying, "Wow, this is actually kind of nuts. I need to find the virtuous middle." But I mean, what would you say to those who are on either extreme? Because I'll preface it with this. I know that you were at one point associated with the National Catholic Register,
Mhm.
and you are very much associated with Archbishop Chaput, having worked for him in two dioceses. And so someone could look at that and say, well, he's just a conservative.
Mhm.
But having been on the panel with you on Catholics in the Public Square for 3 times now, I at least have some insight into the fact that that is not an apt description of you. That there's far more nuance to your positions, which I very much appreciate because I try to embody those nuances as well. I mean, good distinctions, that's what we're all about, is seeking out that virtuous middle. So anyway, all of that said, how would you respond to someone who is flirting with the extremes?
I think and look, I dealt with this issue myself. I deal with it all the time, and I'll tell you a story about that in a moment. But I mean, anger is the go-to emotion of the moment, and it's on both sides, and it
Hmm.
produces really a lot of deeply sad feeling. In the sense that it's wonderful to be angry, because what's happening? You're angry at someone else for their transgressions, which means instinctively that you don't have that you're
Right.
free of that. And there's a self-justification going on there. And anger, as I said a moment ago, is deeply appealing because it makes you feel alive, makes you feel good in a perverse sense. So it's addictive. And that addiction turns into poison. And that's what we're seeing in a political and ecclesial environment right now. If you look at our politics, what's our choice in 2024? Bad, worse, or weird? I mean, depending on whether you're for Trump,
No,
Biden,
that's
or
right.
Kennedy,
That's right.
I mean, it's just a bizarre environment. And if you look at the conviction both of Trump and of Hunter Biden, there is a vindictiveness in both of those things and an imprudence, whether or not they were guilty of anything. The fact is that we're in new territory now in terms of publicly humiliating our public officials and then asking us to respect them at the same time. It doesn't work. It increases the toxicity of the political and cultural environment. And that spills over into the church. You mentioned the National Catholic Reporter a moment ago. The reporter, for me, is a perfect example of a certain kind of Catholic faith that reduces the salvific content to a system of positive social ethics. And of course, those positive social ethics, concern for the poor and marginalized, very, very important element of the church, but they're not the essence of her work. The church is first vertical, secondarily horizontal. The horizontal can't be separated out or ignored, but it's not the purpose. We're not meant for this world. We're meant for the next. I think that you see that reflected in strong impulse to legitimize homosexuality, for example, to just make that issue go away by accepting it. Same with abortion. It's very and then on the right, what do you see? You see this kind of flight into an imagined tradition, an addiction to the Latin Mass. Well, I like the Latin Mass, but I served the Latin Mass for years as an altar boy. It could be transformatively beautiful and profoundly boring. And it's not that kind of flight into an imagined nostalgic past, particularly on the right, just doesn't work. It's not life sustaining. So we need to respect the past and we need to engage the future based on prudent, faithful Christian discipleship that has a concern for other people first, and more importantly, because we love Jesus Christ. And that cocktail has gotten all mixed up over the last few decades, really.
Well, and what you just described about finding that virtuous middle and being prudent in how we approach these things, holding fast to the past and what is true, looking to the future. I mean, that was embodied by Archbishop Chaput in his ministry.
He's never conservative. That's complete nonsense. I mean, he was a Capuchin Franciscan. The Capuchins were a radical reform movement within the Franciscan family. He was very committed to the poor, but that gets ignored. He's just called a culture warrior because he was
stood up for Catholic doctrine.
Yeah, basically that's the way to put it. Yeah. I mean, it's not that he did, for example, on the issue of same-sex relationships. I mean, that's a really important issue that requires an enormous amount of sensitivity and patience in dealing with it. The idea of just simply, throwing these people out of the church is nuts. I mean, that's just it lacks charity. But charity has to be based in truth, and the Word of God has very strong words about improper sexual relations. And if you try to ignore that or make it go away, it just doesn't work. You're not being compassionate. You're being honest.
Switching gears a little bit back to the book, and I'll end with this question, and you can kind of take it wherever you like. And if the conversation continues, great. If not, we'll just let it be, as I'm sure both of us would be fine talking for hours and hours and hours by personality and temperament. So when you were putting this book together, when you were doing these interviews, I mean, given your long career in diocesan ministry and speaking to as many people as you've spoken to, are there any people in these 103 that really stood out to you where you said, wow, I really learned something here?
Yeah, well, the interview with Ursula, the chapter, I think 6 or 7, I forget which it is, but the chapter on special people had a particular on me because of our son and grandchildren with special needs. But honestly, the Ursula and Matt Hennessy interview is just absolutely outstanding. It's one of the best things I've ever done, I think, just having the encounter with them. But, I mean, the there's a bishop who is a great guy. He's a personal friend, not the archbishop, but a bishop that I've known for a long time. Great guy who I interview anonymously, and he talks about, when you're an auxiliary bishop, I mean, you have a lot of duties and you're learning the job, but you're not the boss. So you can always kind of shuffle the bad stuff off on the boss. When you're the boss, there's no escaping it. It's like you're no longer a real person. You're the bishop, and you become an institution instead of a real person. And I thought that was a fascinating kind of an insight. And I was very moved by the Chris Pereira's interview and Monica Tafura's interview. Monica's from Colombia, Chris is from Peru. Their perspectives on the country were I think, very powerful. And the apostolates that work. I don't know if I'm answering your question properly, but those are the things that I look back on and say, wow, that was great. I was really glad that I got that done. So
yeah, I mean, it's hard to encounter these people who are so faithful and so wise and intelligent and doing such good work and not be changed by it in some way. I mean, you have to be a heartless person, unfeeling, uncaring individual to just say, yeah, that's really interesting, and then move on with your life unchanged.
Yeah.
One
of the things that just to finish that this occurred to me after I thought I'd finished the interviews with the 20 interviews with lay people, the formators. They're all really, really interesting, but the women are really extraordinary. I mean, they're just they're brilliant. But I specifically wanted women who were married, mothers, and some attributive element to their church life. I mean, not all of them are married, but I did the same with men. The husbands, fathers, and active, but that their life experiences, women's life experiences of the church, are particularly beautiful because they're particularly feminine, and of course, the church is feminine. And I thought their perspective was really, really interesting, particularly since the 10 women are followed by the 10 men, and the comparison between their perspectives, all faithful, but their perspectives the difference in their perspectives was, I think, kind of interesting.
It's it's something that I've been thinking more about, especially doing this podcast. I mean, I'm just getting into doing interviews really for the first time.
Well, you're good.
I appreciate that, but what I've learned is, man, that talking heads thing. I think it was Dr. Tim O'Malley from Notre Dame. He had posted something on LinkedIn one day, and he said, I think I'm going to take a break from writing so much so that I can read more. And it just hit me to the core. I was like, wow, I need to do that. I had been writing profusely, like just way too much writing. Yeah. And I hadn't been reading any books. And so I switched that around December of last year, where I was reading maybe 2 or 3 books a week. And it was like my desire to talk and say something, it just evaporated. And then I started doing more of these interviews, and I was doing maybe like 2 or 3 interviews a week for Good Distinctions. And I was just learning so much. And I'm young. I'm 32. I got a lot to learn. And you were speaking about life experience. And so for anyone listening who's in their early 20s, a little piece of advice that I would give as someone not much older than you is shut up and listen more.
Absolutely. God, that's so true. When I was an editor, one of the things that I learned very quickly was editors, once they find a talented writer, ride him or her into the ground. And it dulls their blade. It's better to write less, but more thoughtfully and better than write a whole lot all the time. And that goes to the talking head thing. I mean, I don't want to do that. I also believe that none of us is very important, except in the eyes of God.
Amen.
And so helping other people be effective is much more powerful than, Fran Maier Incorporated. It just that never works in the long run, because you have to constantly jack yourself up and tell other people that you're important when in fact you're really not, except in the kind of support and love that you give to other people. I mean, that's just a general principle of being alive that we Americans tend to diminish because we think we're self-made and independent and autonomous. Oh, that's baloney. We're none of those things. You know,
Right.
if you're a mature adult, you can achieve wonderful things and you can improve the world by your contribution. But in the long run, we're all going to be forgotten. We're all part of a narrative that's much more important than any one of us. And again, that goes back to the point of the book. I mean, I think Rusty Reno, for example, at First Things, and George Weigel, both those guys have been personal friends and professional friends of mine for decades. And they're very good at what they do, and the work that they do is very important. But I don't want to do that. I'm much better, I think, at giving other people an opportunity to talk because they're interesting. You know, people are all interesting if they get them talking about what they really feel strongly about. And I just felt that was a better way for me personally to go.
I interviewed a man named Dan Oblinger. I'm not sure if you've met him. He's in Kansas. He was a hostage negotiator for a long time before he retired. And now he gives workshops on active listening to corporate conventions. But we had a fascinating conversation about active listening and just how important it is. Because he has plenty, I mean, you have plenty of good things to say. He has plenty of good things to say. Hopefully I do as well. But if we're not seeking to understand the story of the person we're speaking to, then we're going to miss something. Probably something fairly profound.
Yeah. I've got two stories about listening that I'll tell, personal stories. One of them is that, you know, as I've gotten older, I've noticed that my hearing is slightly off, and it was really beginning to bother me. And so I went into audiologist, a doctor, you know, and a woman, and I did the test and everything, and she came in and said, you know, Fran, your hearing is great. You need to work on your listening, which my wife just absolutely loved, right?
I'm sure.
I mean,
yeah.
Because I think husbands tend to turn the volume down somehow on stuff that they've heard 100 times before. It's just part of human nature. But your fundamental point of learning how to listen is really, really a good one. Because again, people who are passionate about something are always interesting to listen to. Understand what it is about that thing that you find so completely addictive. You know, I used to kind of constantly ply my father-in-law about the law because he was a very good and a very effective attorney. And this was the first year after I was married. I was pressing him about something. And he finally said, you know, Fran, you already got the girl. Could we please talk about golf? So anyhow, it's just a personal story. But human beings are interesting. God made them interesting. If you can get them to be honest about what they feel passionate about.
Amen. I think that's a perfect place to end. I think that encapsulates kind of what you were about with this book and what we're seeking to do, both on this podcast as well as a lot of what you're doing. I see a lot of similarities there. And for those listening, definitely go back and check out that episode with Dan Oblinger on active listening. It really was a good one. And absolutely go and purchase a copy of True Confessions, Voices of Faith from a Life in the Church by Fran Maier by Ignatius Press. And I'll be putting the link to that in the show notes. But Fran, any final words?
Yeah, you're an example, Will, of exactly what the book is talking about. There are all these tremendous lay apostolates out there from people who are just trying to do the right thing. And Good Distinctions is a perfect example of that. It's one of 100 others that are out there doing really great work that don't get proper attention. So it's really a pleasure being on the podcast because I want you to succeed because you're really smart. You're doing the Lord's work. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. And I appreciate having you on. And thanks for your time.
Well, God bless you.
You as well. Everyone listening, please go to gooddistinctions.com to subscribe for free and get all the past episodes, any future content that I put out, which will, as we've alluded to, be much less written content and much more quality written content. But thank you, Fran. Thanks for coming on.
You bet. God bless you.